So next up on the channel is going to be an eticule, and basically the reason for the title is because no one really knows what that word means, myself included before I was approached with this project. But basically an eticule is a fancy architectural word for a decorative frame that surrounds some sort of shrine. So there's going to be a mosaic in the middle. I'm not responsible for that. I'm not installing that or anything like that. I was just responsible for the frame. And there's actually going to be more to this. There's another about 12 inches worth of a crowned decorative arch top that will also go on top of this. So one of the main reasons for the title was because people aren't going to Google how to make one of these, because most people don't really know what these are. That was one of the reasons. The other thing about this is, even though this is a very specialized custom piece of furniture, with the way that I built it and the techniques that I used, I still think people that are interested in learning about woodworking can gather and glean a lot of information from these videos. All of this is not solid wood, it's all torsion boxes. I designed it so that it would be structurally sound, not really have to worry about warping, but also save money because this is made out of mahogany. But then also all of the moldings were custom made in the shop, and I don't have fancy molding tools, so you'll see how I do all of that. And that's basically what this series is going to be. It's easily top 5, one of the most challenging projects I've ever built. So it's going to be quite a few parts. And that's basically what that is. So if you watch the channel, you remember a few months ago I made some historical reproductions of some moldings for a client, and I said I was going to have another big project for them, and that's what this is. So this is all also going to be made out of mahogany, and it's going over this niche. There's going to be a mosaic in the middle, and then the frame I'm building is going to go into that niche a little bit, but also set on the front of the brick wall. So they provided me with architectural drawings, which was a little bit of a blessing and a curse. I'm self-taught, so I'm not used to reading stuff like this. The scale, because it's standard measurements, the scale was a little wonky, so I had to go through and convert all of the measurements to make it easier for myself to read. This part right here is the windowsill I'm working on. Because there's varying dimensions, some of this sets all the way back in the niche, some of it sets on top of the brick wall, so designing it was a little difficult. Basically I'm going to start with the sill. That was my first step in this. I built some of this as I went, but in order to make this a little bit easier to understand, I'm going to show you, try and lump these videos into parts. So you can see that the mosaic is going to take up 3/4 of an inch, and then there's a marble frame on top of that mosaic. So I had to account for that 1.5 inches within the windowsill. So once I had all of the measurements converted, so that all of that had to be done with a ruler, and then you would have to scale it up based on a chart I found online, I could start making this windowsill. Now the windowsill was a little bit of trial and error. When I started building this, I had a basic idea of how I wanted to do it. Like I said in the introduction, it was all torsion boxes, but I changed my plan slightly as I went, so this is going to probably be the longest video. Once I had this all sorted out, all the other pieces are similar construction, they went much faster. So this sill will have a flat part so that the marble frame and the mosaic can sit on top of that, and then it slopes towards the front. The degree that I'm cutting here, I believe, if I remember correctly, was about 12 inches, and this whole piece I think was 9 3/4, and that was inaccurate. It wasn't technically my mistake, and like I said, I will cover that in a later video. It all ended up working out, but that was a mistake on the drawings. So I'm making this, like I said, in multiple parts. Torsion boxes are basically sandwiches. You have a top and a bottom, and then in between you have perpendicular slats. And then you could clamp the whole piece together. So if I had, this material wise is already well over $2,000. If I had made this out of solid mahogany, I could have easily doubled that number. By making these with torsion boxes, not only do I think torsional boxes are extremely structurally strong, but these are very long pieces of lumber, and when you clamp everything, it flattens some of these boards as well. So this is just basically roughing out the pieces. You could see I made that angle, and I made a scrap piece of plywood in order to mimic how this is going to go, and then I use that as I went. So right now all of this is just propped up on materials in the shop in order to get those measurements. And now I'm going to go through and put dados in here. I decided to put dados in everything, and then that piece of plywood will sit in those dados to make my glue ups easier, but also keep this strong. So this looks like a very in-depth process. It's really not that bad. I put a dado stack in my radial arm saw. I raised the blade to the height I wanted, and I'm going to cut center. I have one piece, the base is the piece I'm working off of, and then I will set up my fence based off that base every time, and then I cut all of my other pieces at the same time. That means that all of these cuts are going to line up perfectly for all of the pieces, so when I go to put those plywood angles in, everything lines up. And then when I clamp this together, like I said, I'm saving on materials. It's extremely strong, and it will flatten some of these bowed bigger pieces of lumber. So like I said, I was kind of designing this as I went. So this first one, there is some trial and error. You could see over here I'm putting a 3/4 inch dado on the edge. I decided to end up putting solid mahogany over there, so I widen that a little bit later. But basically I make the center and the 2 edge cuts. I have a fence all set up. All these cuts, like I said, are on all of the pieces. And then once I have that, I could go through and do all of my middle pieces. So it's pretty simple. I can move it over. These marks are rough marks. I tried to stick to about a 4-inch wide spread on all of this. I didn't want it to be too wide. So it came out 4 inches, every 4 inches from center. But as long as my marks lined up per piece, it didn't necessarily matter if they were off of the original marks, if that makes sense. As you can see, I'm cutting these, so I'm going to line it up to my base because that is the one with all of the measurements on it. Clamp it in place. I can cut the base, and then I'll keep everything the same. I could flip it around because it's like I said, I came off both sides from the center, and then I could go through and cut all of my other pieces, and that will guarantee that all of these are accurate. So I have the top, the bottom, the flat section, and then the front. So then when I went to go put this all together, it was a little too tall. My plywood piece, I didn't account for how thick the dados were going to be, because when I made that, I hadn't decided yet how thick they were going to be. So basically all I had to do was go and cut down this triangle piece, and then I could put everything back together. So once I did the math, I basically had to cut down that triangle by about 1 1/8 inches. Once I did that, that is what that looks like. And you could see the bow in this lumber, so all of that bowing will come out once you clamp all this. And then I could just go through and make a bunch of strips of plywood, and I could cut those plywood pieces into triangles as well. The other big thing I was thinking about for this whole build was this is going outside. So that was also a big consideration. I do things a little bit differently when I know things are going to be exposed to the elements. Luckily, this is on the side of a building, and it's basically in an alley, so it's not going to get as much exposure as something that's facing west or east or something like that. So that was a little bit of a bonus. And then I could go through and put this on. This was a lot of taking pieces apart, putting pieces together, and it's going to be like that for the whole build. Because like I said, especially on this one, I was kind of building as I went. So at this point I could put it all together, and then I could decide how I'm going to attach that front piece to cover that plywood. I could put the flat backer on there, and then square everything up, and then see basically what I'm working with. So that's what that looks like, the basic structure I have going from here. And then for the front, what I decided to do was notch out a bunch of pieces so I could slide that front in. So that's what I'm going to do next. You can see I marked it on the board. you could see how the front's going to fit in, and then I could go from there. Now the front, like I said, I didn't know how big it was going to be, so it's a little bit wider than I needed. It's better to have it wider than too short. And same thing, it's going to be the same angled cut, 12 degrees. I can go through and cut this piece, line up my marks, cut all the pieces, and build as I go. You can see in the background I had already started working on other parts of this, but like I said, I found it's probably going to be the easiest to understand how all this stuff is going together if I show you each part completely. And then there's the cut. I was using my tall fence to make this second angled cut. It's the same degrees, 12 degrees. Just trying to use a flashlight so you could see it, because that tall fence blocks out the light in the shop. And then I could just send that through the table saw as well and cut off that front. So then that is what that cut looks like. I could prop this back into place. And like I said, those plywood pieces are going to also attach to the front, and that's how that turned out. So the problem with this one was, especially at first when I didn't really know how to put it together, I had to use a lot of clamps. Once I had put this together and taken it apart a couple times, it was a little bit easier. So now I have to go through and cut my triangles. I cut those down a couple times because I kept changing the dimensions on this. But like I said, I have this clamp together, and then I could go through and I'm going to cut that front, the dado that's going to go in the front, and then the triangles will have to be cut as well. So this isn't a dado, this is a rabbit. And there's the mark for that piece. So I'm sure a lot of people that are more talented than myself can look at these drawings and make all these pieces perfectly. The way I build and the way I've always built is this way. I like to mock stuff up, see how it's going to look, mark my boards, and then cut pieces that way. I find whenever I have a cut list and I try to cut everything at once, it never works out for me. I'm sure, like I said, it works out for other people. So that is one of the reasons this process was so long, because I kept having to take this apart, make marks, put it back together, make adjustments, and put things back together. But it's been going together pretty well so far. So this is that rabbit I'm cutting out of there. You can see I'm just using a regular blade. I didn't set up the dado. That was the other problem with this build. There are so many dados, swapping them in and out amongst my saws got really tedious. So if I had to make an extra cut or two just to not have to swap out a saw, I did end up doing that as well. And then the bottom piece of this will slide right into place. And then that is how that front turned out. So making this twice would be much easier, because now that I know how I wanted to do it, I can go through and make those cuts. But building as you go does take longer. So then you could see I have to trim a little bit off the back. It was funny watching this footage. If you end up watching all these videos, I wish I wouldn't have done this. But at the time I was following a particular measurement on the drawings and not the one I should have been following. But like I said, you'll see that in a later video. So I could trim down the bottom to account for the fact that it was sticking further out the back. And then, like I said, all of my triangles also had to be trimmed. And then this is the basic structure. So from here I could go through and just add the sides, and then this will also have to be notched out. And like I said, I originally cut these to account for a 3/4 inch ply. All this mahogany is 13/16. I got all this mahogany when I ordered the moldings from Woodworker Source. I did that because it was on sale at the time. Mahogany is really hard to find in general, especially genuine mahogany. It's very expensive. They were having an amazing sale, so I bought a bunch of it at once. And this will also come finished on, this came finished on 3 sides. So one side was ripped straight, the top and bottoms were planed, and it's about 13/16 inch thickness. Now I know some people pride themselves on milling their own lumber. I don't dislike milling lumber, but especially on a project like this, it saved me so much time just being able to pull a piece of lumber off of a stack and start working with it. I don't have a fancy joiner. My planers a desktop planer essentially. So going through, if I had to mill all this lumber, would have taken forever. So that is one of the reasons why on bigger projects like this, I sometimes order supplies. First off, like I said, it is hard to find, but it saves so much time in a shop like mine to just be able to start using the materials. So that is why I did that. Sometimes people will ask me stuff like that. And then you saw I just widened the dados on that piece, and I didn't want a bunch of end grain showing, so you could see I made a thicker cut, so it's just a little piece of end grain showing, and then I could just go through with a pencil and mark where to cut that end triangle. I'm keeping overhangs on all these edges. I'll cut that flush at the end. So then from the drawings, like I said, I have to notch this out. This was also another mistake, and you'll see how I fix it in a later video. And it was ironic because I specifically notched this out when it wasn't glued together yet, because I knew it would be much easier to do it that way. And then in a later video you'll see how I have to extend the notch by about 1 inch, and that was when it was all glued together. So you'll also see that technique. And basically what I did was I just used the table saw to cut this out, and then the radial arm saw. I wasn't super concerned with parts of this that you wouldn't see, so the table saw blade is going to cut a little bit into the underside of this, but it's okay for something like this. Once this is glued together, you're never going to see it. The backs of all of this you're never going to see, so I did take some liberties with not making it as nice on those parts. And this front is also going to be covered by the columns, so you can see I cut a little bit too far on that one side. All of that was nothing I had to worry about because you won't see it. So then I cut the other piece with the radial arm saw, and then I could go through with the hand saw and finish this up. So that's what that looks like. And then once I had that top done, I could just go through and mark my sides and my bottoms and do the exact same thing. So this was pretty simple. I just cut these down. And same, I'm going through this quickly because it's the exact same process. This is the base, lowering it onto the table saw blade and cutting out that notch in the back. So obviously, like I said, this is a niche, so the part from the notch back is going to actually sit inside the niche, and the part from the notch forward is what is going to overhang the wall. And then, like I said, exact same process, radial arm saw, use the hand saw to cut this. And then this is almost, believe it or not, it is not done yet, but it is almost done. And then that's what that looks like with the notches out of it. So then I wasn't going to put a back on this. So you'll see when I make these torsion boxes, I make the back in the beginning. It makes life a little bit easier. And that's because you're never going to see it. But since this is going outside, I didn't want plywood, especially exposed to potential rain, getting behind the sill. So that's when I decided towards the end to put a back on this. So I'm adding these rabbets after the fact. And that's all that is. It's just a little notch going through the back. I tried to avoid butt joints at all costs on this. Those are going to be, in woodworking in general, I try to avoid them, but especially stuff outside, it's going to be your most vulnerable joint. In the shop, I use Type Bond 3, which is rated for exterior use, so this will hold up pretty well. But those are just basically the notches I put on the back, and I didn't film it, but I cut a piece of wood to fit in place of those notches, so the whole thing will look solid, essentially. And have no openings. But that's what I meant when I said they're torsion boxes and they're hollow, saving on materials. And I could take this whole thing apart. I did think they were cool objects to look at with all of these pieces and all of these slats. It's visually appealing. It's just unfortunate for stuff like this in woodworking. Breadboards are quite similar. It's all this time spent on something that no one will ever see. So that was basically what it was, and I could go through and put all this glue on there. The other nice thing about this design is all of these joints, all these dados, the rabbets, the plywood, anytime you can multiply your gluing surface is going to make it stronger. So that was a bonus as well. You could see the glue up takes quite a while because there is a lot of area to cover. I did think about putting this inside my vacuum press, but I was a little nervous. The vacuum press is an extremely powerful piece of machinery, and especially on these angled pieces, even with putting brads and stuff in place, I was a little nervous about the vacuum press forcing things out of shape. But that would have been a nice way to have done this. I also, at this point, was still working on that huge built-in. I just did not have the space in the shop to set up my vacuum press. And then once it was all glued together, I could use my trim bit and my router to clean up these edges. And that was a lot of, this is a pretty long video to show this process. I'm trying to show things a little bit slower so people can get a better idea of what's going on. And like I said, this will probably be the longest one because all of these mistakes I made building this one, I fixed for all the consecutive pieces.